Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations work past the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, Tom Granot is a solution engineer at Lightrun. Tom joins us today from Tel Aviv in Israel. Tom Granot, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here, Robby.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
So the first one is kind of banal, but I do think it wins by a large margin, which is good documentation. So it's not really about the docs themselves, which are of course important to have and important to that they're organized and well structured and everything is fine. But the actual bug reports that define the issues that happen inside the system are even more important than that, because they give you this glimpse into this mind of the developer currently working and debugging some sort of bug in the system. And then when you're approaching it, 2, 3, 7 years into the future, if it's a well-maintained software that is still around at that time, then you can almost, if you have enough familiarity with the code base, you can almost kind of see the next steps. When the developer is working, when you're reading the bug report, you're thinking, wait, so that person did this and then this and then this. And I can also see myself doing this and then this, but maybe instead of step 3, I would have taken something a bit different. And then the path towards success is much, much shorter. And I do want to kind of specify what I mean by a good bug report. So it's not just complete stack traces and understanding exactly what is going on inside the system at any given point, but it's contextual. It's the opinion of the developer while he's working or she's working through the problem, kind of trying to break it apart and see what's happening inside of it. This is something that not many people do. I do that when I write. When I debug, I work through it by writing what I think, and then at the end I have a nice write-up that deals everything I thought through while I was debugging. And I find, again, I'm probably biased, but I find that these reports are the things that I look for the most in in software that I consider well maintained. It's something that is specifically apparent to me.
I'm curious, just to make sure that we're all, and the listeners are all on the same page as far as what you're referring to as, like, say, a bug report. Are you referring to more so on the, as you mentioned, like software developers and the stack traces? Maybe you could provide a little bit more context there for the listeners? Right.
So my perspective on bug reports is kind of more in the kind of the ticketing front. So I'm thinking a developer caught a bug and then reported on it in a way that is available for another developer to maybe work on it. And then the other developer who came in to start working on the bug and trying to figure it out, they wrote what they thought while they were fixing the problem. So a bug report is not exactly the correct term. I guess an issue, basically a ticket where a bug report is being worked on is what I'm referring to in this context.
I see. Do you find that there's like engineers when they're working on resolving a bug or trying to even, maybe before they even resolve it, trying to understand what is actually happening? It's kind of like you have to grasp the context of like, all right, we got an error on this specific API endpoint is triggering some sort of error occasionally. So you're thinking more in lines, okay, now there's a ticket in a ticketing system somewhere. People have been able to track down, like, here's the snapshot of the stack trace and the error. What other information do we have about, like, do we know which user it was or what they were trying to do? That type of information. But then also, like, the developer going through the process of sharing what they've learned along the way. Like, here's the conditions that we seem to think that this is isolated to.
Yes, and I'd like to kind of put this in context of an open source project, right? So if you're looking at an open source project that's, in my opinion, well-maintained, one of the core reasons it is well-maintained, or maybe the enabler for its well-maintainability, if you will, is the fact that there are multiple developers doing this same process at any given time, at any given kind of vertical inside the project, breaking apart things and writing things up as they go along. And this knowledge base, this epitome of understanding that is codified inside the issues, enables more developers who are not as well onboarded into the project dive in and fix it better. And this is a bit nuanced in the sense that what I assume many people would think of when we're talking about well-maintained software is the actual acts of the packager, the maintainer, the people who are writing the code, the release manager or whatever, basically everyone who's dealing with actually distributing the software out there. But in my opinion, when I'm looking at a project and I'm saying, oh, I think this is a a lot of love is going into this project right now. To me, that's always these like well thought out issues, like well thought out pieces of writing that are in there, showing the developer walking through the things as they kind of break things apart. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that's helpful. I'm always curious how, when people are joining new to them projects that have been around for a while, and they're trying to help out fix a bug or something. Are you kind of referring to a scenario where there's more details on how this particular project goes about debugging things, or is it that do you anticipate that a lot of developers will go back and read close tickets to see how and use that as for context for how they might address a different, maybe potentially similar issue or something resurfaced?
So I guess this whole kind of discussion brings this. I saw on Arca News a while back the concept of I think the name was Architecture MD. So basically, a document that details how the architecture of the problem of the open source project looks like from the perspective of kind of an experienced developer. So if an experienced developer were to jump into the code, like an experienced Java developer will jump into this library and figure out exactly what is going on, this document, being a proficient Java developer, will help him figure out exactly which parts are where and what is talking to what, without actually having to comb through the code and all the documentation to understand what's going on. Kind of a high-level architecture overview, I guess. So in my opinion, these well-thought-out issues are not that, they're not high-level architectural overviews, but they are vertical explanations of things that allow you to kind of get a glimpse on the larger picture. So it enables you to kind of get a grasp of everything while you're working on one issue in particular.
Right. So I can say that can be helpful just to get that, as you're saying, like that big picture, because trying to map together everything, just looking at the code is, there's only so much you can keep in your brain, I suppose, as you're trying to, create this network in your brain of all these different pieces, and then facets of the technology platform or a piece of software or a library, might be up on an open source project somewhere. What do you think, when it comes to, one of the things I've talked with a number of guests about is how documentation tends to be a very difficult thing to maintain as well. And it's like its own challenge because it's kind of like, there's like, well, it's over here. And I know you mentioned there's architecture, there's like a markdown file in the project that can be helpful to try to hopefully keep that updated. Have you seen some good patterns or workflows for teams to remember to keep that consistently updated on a regular basis so that there's not the scenario where someone joins and then they're starting to look through a document like that and they're thinking, oh, and then they're like, oh, I'm curious about this one thing, and then they talk to another person on the team, like, well, that's actually kind of outdated. And then you start to stop trusting the documentation that's there. And you're like, well, I guess the only way to really know the source of truth is to look at the code. So how do you help and encourage that in a team to keep those types of things updated? Like, brought up like example of fixing a bug. Like my immediate issue is fixing this problem. I figured out the solution. I've done this, but maybe I'm not re-architecting anything. But I might have made some changes that could make some of the documentation elsewhere outdated.
Right. No, I get your point. So what I honestly like to do when thinking of these systems that I want to put in place when working in a team is basically a two-pronged approach. First and foremost is these kind of content gates, or like PR gates, if you will, on commits that you push into the code. So if the documentation checks and things you can do automatically to ensure that the quality stays up. But this is kind of the easier issue of like, these are the things that are easier to fix because they're easier to scan for. The harder things is fixing, guides, tutorials, pieces that are kind of inside a documentation, but an API change from one version to another, and then you have to actually update the guide, and nobody actually updates the guide later on. And I think that the core of the issue is understanding what maps to what. So a guide usually touches upon multiple API points, right? So it's hard to automatically always map everything back to the specific kind of API that was changed at a specific commit, and then fix that right there and then. In my opinion, the maintainer's job, and I'm also a maintainer, is making sure that these type of things, let's call them the less well mapped out guides, right? The tutorial type of things, just get reviewed every once in a while in an automatic way. You either add a bot that opens PRs for you automatically to review a specific thing, or you actually have a cadence and calendar invites, reminders are a thing I use religiously, and it works very well. And you do that, and you review like a specific portion maybe, or a specific guide or something like that. And because you're already in the context, oh wait, this doesn't make any sense anymore. You do a one-line change that automatically updates the guide to being relevant, which is that's the whole game, right? That's how you keep things in sync. There's no easy path here, right? It's work.
Do you use the metaphor technical debt at all in your day-to-day work?
Yes, most definitely. And technical debt is not just a piece of software that needs refactoring. Technical debt is a person not understanding a specific part of the business well, or not understanding a specific part of the code base well. That's the two are synonymous in my opinion. So if a person is writing logic, or is writing a new feature that's supposed to be pushed into the product, they don't really understand exactly how it fits into the bigger narrative of the product. That's technical debt right there, right? That's a person writing something without full context inside their mind while they're working on it. So I guess if I had to talk about technical debt, I would actually split it in two, which is kind of a recurring theme for me. If you're following a two-pronged approach to everything. So the first thing is the actual technical debt. How is it usually defined? Code that needs refactoring, documentation that needs work, basically any type of technical work that needs changing. But the other part, the more nuanced, and something that I truly think not enough people are focusing on, because it's not easy. And it's more amorphic. It's less well defined. It's this gap in knowledges of a person in the job that they're currently doing. So a person needs to have, again, as full a context as possible into the problem they're trying to solve. And if they don't, then that is, in my opinion, technical debt. If it's a technical person doing a technical job and they don't have the full context, that's technical debt. And it's your job as a team lead, as a senior dev, even as a team member for another person. If you're saying something and it doesn't click, right? It doesn't make sense. It's not supposed to work like that. Then educate, learn, or at least point to the right link in the right place in the docs. Just.
Have you been in a scenario where you're working with some developers and you feel like they're mislabeling something as technical debt?
Mislabeling something as technical debt. That's a good question. The main thing that we're forgetting a lot of the time as developers is that people are people, right? So people will be people. They will be irrational. They will do things that people do. And then when you're looking at something and you're saying there's a problem here, it immediately gets labeled as technical debt, right? It's technical debt because it's something we can quantify, put in the slide, put into Jira, put in whatever, and then fix. But a lot of the time, communication breakdowns, one developer who hates the guts of another developer, right, and doesn't want to work with that developer on something, and then that something doesn't get work on, gets piled on the technical debt because it didn't get worked on. But while it is per se technical debt, the core of the problem is not from there. It's from the breaking in the communication between these two people. So a good team lead will notice that and not just focus on, again, checking boxes and moving things around, but on actually breaking apart this communication barrier between the two people. I guess that's the most common thing I would say gets mislabeled.
Are there some specific things that you've added to, say, your PR templates to help make things simpler for the people that are submitting code contributions to a project you're part of, to help alleviate some of the need to follow up and check on things? I
actually have a role model though. So there's a project I really like called Monica. Monica is a personal CRM system. It's written in PHP, and they have a very detailed checklist when you want to submit a PR, including things like putting your name in contributors MD and stuff like that. Basically a lot of things that are kind of good for maintaining a long-term open source project, and it's a pretty long-term one. Updating the docs, stuff like that. If you can link to the show notes, I can then you just give a link and then everybody can show it. I don't remember all the items now, but I do remember that whenever, and I've used the system for, I don't know, I guess 5 years by now. And I contribute whenever I can, installation instructions, a bit of code here and there, just, add things whenever I can. And I always was impressed by, I forget the guy's name, but I will also, if possible, will send a link to their, to the repo. I think they're Canadian. Anyways, the attention to details there is remarkable, and I would if you want an example, just look at that one.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll definitely follow up with you after this, and we can get a link for that for the audience. For those that might not be familiar with the terminology, what does it mean to introduce observability into your software? I know that's a term and an approach that's been talked about and starting to get more traction over the last few years, in recent years at least, and even some other tools that have been kind of in the monitoring space are kind of rebranding themselves as observability, because I think it's like a interesting topic, rebranding or rethinking how they're communicating about what their product does. But having said, putting that aside for a moment, but what is observability?
Sure. So I would say that the core of the definition relates to how the system appears like from the outside. So there's a production system somewhere, and it tells a story, right? It spits out logs, there's metrics being instrumented on it. There's a lot of information being gathered at any given production system anywhere at any given time. The developer, on the other hand, or the person who's in charge of monitoring the system, needs to have enough context in order to understand what is going on without having to do too many actions, because software will have bugs. That's just a fact of life, and it's okay to have incidents if you have the amount of information you need in order to solve them quickly and in time, and of course the tooling to fix them and so forth. But I'm talking about information for now. So I guess observability can be defined as the ability to understand the system, all the information in all the contexts and all the granularity you need, without having to ship new code to that system. So looking at the system and getting the information you want out of it right away. That is the core of the definition, I think. And when monitoring tools rebrand themselves as observability tools, what they're actually saying, in my opinion, is that, hey, if you install vendor X's monitoring stack, then you will now have full observability into your system. But this kind of bits the point in a sense, because it's not just about the tooling. It's also about the practices behind it. In the same way that, not every company who's bought a CI/CD pipeline now follows the DevOps methodology, right? It's just another buzzword that people throw on when talking about tooling and systems, and sometimes kind of miss the core part of, right, which is taking things and taking processes and making them better. And observability is the same way. So there are tooling that is designed to make systems more observable. Monitoring systems are one subset of such tooling. But there's also practices that can enable a system to be more observable. That's writing code in a way that makes it easier to understand exactly what's going on when something happens. And of course, to be able to add and remove information in an easy fashion when you need it in the next sprint, right? So if you want to add, a piece of information that brings a lot of context, a lot of knowledge into the system, it should be really easy for a developer to do. And I'm not talking about a log line, but for example, dumping a complicated structure from memory into some form that can later be parsed or analyzed, or things that can be worked on post haste after investigating, or while you're investigating a problem, is also, in my opinion, considered something that can make a system more observable. It's working towards that. It's something that is a continuous practice and not just, let's buy a tool and be done with it.
Do you have some other interesting examples that people can think about, just to kind of help expand what the context of how would I go about, why would I need that? Maybe it's if outside of a bug.
So I think the kind of the most interesting one is that, well, I guess I'll preface this with something that I've seen, and I think everyone has seen, in recent years. So release cycles are getting shorter, right? And it's getting, you got to push software out there much, much faster. And again, CI/CD pipelines, and you have, a lot of tooling that enables you to do that. But I think one of the core things that are kind of an unsolved problem, I guess, or just a hard problem per se, is making sure that your features running on the actual infrastructure that is running your software, not your local machine, work in the same way you expect them to. So I guess what I would be really interested in incorporating into the same notion of observability, kind of put into the discussion, is the fact that you validating your software, verifying that a feature is working correctly in the way that you would expect it to, would completely be part of this entire discussion. So it's not just when something goes wrong, debug it by breaking apart the problem and using observability, but it's a lot about enabling you to move faster, because you can be more sure that this thing you just wrote actually works like you would expect it to in a production setting, in the real world, with all the moving parts, kind of, making all the noise with the actual load the actual system is running on in production. Again, not just your local environment. That's just the most, I guess, the first thing that I would like people to think of, right after, incident resolution, I guess.
Interesting. I'm so curious about also that approach being used to identify maybe areas that are not being used anymore. Maybe there's areas of your code that users aren't using, or very, very few users, and wondering, because I think as software developers, we don't always get an opportunity to feel like we can confidently remove features or code because we're we're worried that someone somewhere is using it, or we don't know, and so we leave it, and then we accumulate all this baggage of stuff that we may not even need to maintain anymore, and we potentially turn it off or something. So, do you find that that is also another type of use case that could be used in that observability type of tooling or practice?
For sure, and I would even go further and say that basically any type of code level information you'd like to gather, which code path is one example of, right? So is that code path reach as much as often as I think it does, right? Any type of application level information is valuable. So if you have a piece of code that is not performing, and you have a piece of code that is never reached, both of them are bad in different ways, right? They'll both cause problems, and they both should be fixed. And I think that, again, so understanding that your features work correctly, debugging incidents in production, and understanding what craft you can remove away from the system are all parts of things that I would expect, kind of a keen developer to observe about the system and say, that's a problem. Let's fix. Speaking of technical debt, right? So.
We'll be back with our interview with Tom in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I wanted to take a quick moment just to say thank you for making time to listen to the Maintainable Software Podcast. If you're finding these discussions valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and/or writing a review on Apple Podcasts to help spread the word. Also, do you know someone that I should be interviewing on Maintainable? Shoot me an email to Robby with a Y at maintainable.fm. And now, let's get back to our interview with Tom Granot. When you're looking at production level data, these tools often provide mechanisms to protect the privacy of the users that are using it. So there can be a somewhat anonymized, because I think there's an interesting thing of like, is there too much of a glimpse into individual things that are happening on a user level that you could be like, well, this person's doing these types of things, then we can market to that person differently. And I'm curious about those types of things, like maybe on a slightly ethical front.
First and foremost, and that everyone who deals with PII, personal identifiable information, knows that it's a hard problem, right? So you want to understand what's going on in the system, and you want to log for things, but now with all the regulations, it's harder to log for all the things you used to want to log. And now it's up to the developer to not only, I guess more the team lead and the architects who kind of construct the entire system, to figure out a way where the developer can get enough information out of the system on one end, and not being creepy on the other end. So there's this like balance of things. And one of the things we do at Lightrun, which is where I work, is that we have a PII redaction feature that basically enables any type of person who uses the software to block out or redact pieces of information that you don't want to be persisted in the log system afterwards. And that's one way that you can solve it. But there's actually, again, in the same sense that we talked about, observability is both tooling and practices. You can have the best tooling in the game and write crappy code that exposes all sorts of information out there, and then who cares about the tooling? Just be sure to incorporate great tooling on one end, but do your job as a team lead to construct processes that make your developers not think about it, but just implement correct data structures and correct flows, and ensuring that they actually do the work as developers and not just rely on the tooling. If that makes sense.
Yeah. That's helpful. And for those listening, I think there's this, the thing around when I talk about like privacy, especially like log files or different tooling, is that, as someone that works on other teams' projects, we get called in to help out with projects. And it's usually one of those things we identify pretty quickly. Like, that there's a lot of log files that have it doesn't have people's passwords, but it's got a lot of personal information in some log files that we track down, and like that stuff should be redacted or obscured somehow before things get logged, right? And so the tooling should provide some mechanisms for that, and it needs to be a conversation that developers are having with their various stakeholders. How liable are we by having this information potentially lingering around on some server somewhere, or showing up some cloud log monitoring tool or something? You mentioned Lightruns, where you work at in the product. Could you tell us a little bit about what's included in Lightrun's service offering and what types of teams are maybe a good fit for it?
Sure. So we talked a lot about observability before, and the kind of the practices and the tooling, and we try and be a mixture of both. And we're an observability platform that's based around developer tooling, which means that we work inside the IDE, inside the CLI. We allow developers to get information from production systems without ever having to leave either tool. And one of the core features we allow basically the addition of, we call them actions, and there are logs, metrics, traces, various observability types of information that enables you to inspect real-time information from the system right inside your IDE. So if you had to understand what's going on in your application, traditionally you'd have to go to the logging tool, and filter for the specific path of the specific user that just performed an action, and then kind of almost surgically try and find exactly which log line is the one that you care about, and so forth. And with Lightrun, what we do is we have this real-time process where you can right-click, add a Lightrun log, set information directly inside your IDE. It's actually a very straightforward tool, as in you would look at it and you would say, okay, that makes sense. And that's awesome that we have that. And of course, while I'm obviously biased, the core of the problem is evident to basically every developer that I talk to. Meaning, if I want to add more information to the running system, what I usually have to do is add a logline or instrument a metric, push to GitHub, wait for CI/CD to finish, wait for the release to roll, wait for the logs to reach the log analyzer, and then filter out all the information. Lightrun, you can just right-click and you're there.
Nice. We'll definitely include links to that to check out the product in the show notes for everybody. For those that might not be familiar also with your role, your title is solutions engineer. What is a solutions engineer responsible for?
So it's a transitional period for me personally. So I started out as a developer advocate working for Lightrun, doing a lot of talks, webinar conferences, virtual conferences because of COVID, but this type of things. And I quickly became almost enamored with how our customers use the tool. And being a startup company, there's the great advantage of visibility, in the sense that if you have a culture that allows for discussions about what is actually happening in different parts of the company, and we thankfully do, you learn a lot about what other teams are doing. And then I'm hearing all of these things that are customer success people and more customer facing people, I guess, are doing. And it's remarkable to see the approaches people take with the basic building blocks that we give. So they have metrics, for example, that we have this piece of code this action. You can basically select a method and wait for it to be invoked, basically. And then when it's invoked, you can get the amount of time it took it to run, right? So this is very useful for debugging what happens, in long chains of methods, where you're not exactly sure which method is the one acting up, and you can go inside that method and then, grab a random number of lines of code, select all of them, right-click, and see how much time this specific line of code took to run, just to understand exactly how long that runs. And our users are using it in remarkable ways to figure out how user flows, requests, are flowing through the system. And I was an SRE before, a site reliability engineer before I joined Lightrun, and I distinctly recall having to work with, having to instrument these things manually, because that's what you do. And the gap is what I'm really passionate about. And when the opportunity came to kind of be more on the architecture side of things, so going to a customer and talking about how Lightrun would fit inside their specific use cases, and specifically hear about what their process looks like and figure out how to kind of pinpoint where Lightrun might be of most use. That's just a great way to spend my days. Just the exact great mixture of people and tech for me.
It's important to share what your customers are doing so you can help your other customers level up themselves. And it's all about sharing and get improving, optimizing the team's workflows and saving them some hopefully time so they can spend more time maybe shipping new things and not just being curious and waiting to get reports back after something finally makes it to production. And I can appreciate that sort of that context there. And then also, it sounds like within the tooling to be able to know here's this method that's being run is actually a really slow method, versus in some older types of tools, and say older, like tools that have been around for more than 5 years, like that's old. Or very like here's the slow parts of your application, and you got to kind of go, okay, how do I go find that in the code? I'm gonna go like look up that area. I'm like, is it that method or is it this SQL query that's running? And like, what's slowing things down for these users? And so that sounds kind of very compelling to be able to like see some of that stuff like maybe in your ID or something, and know that. Does the tooling at all, does that pretty much rely on there having been some production data around that? So if you're producing this, like say a new set of piece of functionality and that's not shipped yet, are you able to get any sort of insights early on, or is that kind of just very much waiting to see? Maybe that's not a bad thing, but at least in terms of like you're going to have to kind of wait and see how like this pans out when you ship it.
So there's a few different ways where you can instrument Lightrun in. So we have people, for example, instrumenting it on staging environment, and then they push some feature there and then kind of kick it around to see how it behaves inside the staging environment. But one of the things that I really like is big data workers, and what people do, and that's actually a really lovely use case for the product, is we have something called snapshots, which are kind of like non-breaking breakpoints. So in a debugger, you have breakpoints. It by definition breaks the service. So a snapshot is like a breakpoint, except it doesn't break the service. So you add it, and you can see all the frames and the variables and all the nice things that's happening inside the context. And what people do is they add this kind of long-running snapshot. So they will put a snapshot in this place in the code, and in this place, and in this place, and in this place, and then put a long kind of, we call it expire, which is the amount of time it stays. And then they put, for example, a 24 hours expiry period. And then they come in, in the morning, after going home, and then something happened at night, right? And then they can look at everything that happened during that crash, or not even an exception with run, just like a weird, the code reached there, but it was just something weird happened without actually breaking the service. Some information got corrupted, or some weird results came in, or whatever, right? The batch job finished, and they get kind of in-depth visibility into exact places they wanted inside the code without having to be near the logs or filter for them later to figure out what happened.
Hi there. Do you know someone who might be looking for assistance with their Ruby on Rails application? Planet Argon would love to meet them. We're offering a $1,000 referral bonus. Send someone our way, and if they sign up for services with Planet Argon, we'll give them a $1,000 discount. And in return, you'll get a check for $1,000 in the mail, just for knowing the right person. Hop on over to planetargon.com/referrals for more information and to refer someone our way. That's planetargon.com/referrals. Thanks.
One thing I want to quickly touch back on. You're talking about documentation, like open source projects and stuff, and it sounds like you spend quite a bit of time writing and explaining things to technical audiences. And in a lot of my conversations with other people on the podcast, we've covered a lot of ground when it comes to like trying to get better as software engineers on how we communicate with, say, I'm air quoting, non-technical audiences. But what do you believe are some like key differences that you see between these two audiences, and what is most effective when communicating to, say, technical audiences versus, say, non-technical audiences?
So I do have to mention that I wasn't always a computer guy. So because I wasn't always a computer guy, I worked, actually had a long stint doing a bunch of various stuff. I was in a youth movement for many years, and in addition, I worked in finance for quite a long while. At one point, I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. I went to study psychology and did that for a long while. So I think I'm not sure. I wouldn't want to generalize, but at least for most developers I know who have been into computers since they were like 4, and then that's all they did for the rest up until now. I spent a long periods of my life outside of tech. Right? Just not wanting to be in tech, just doing other things. And I had the opportunity to present lectures and talk and kind of be more in front of non-technical audiences quite a bit. It's kind of an overgeneralization to say technical and non-technical. I think it's more correct to say, for example, developers and finance people, right? Or developers and environmentally oriented people, right? And in the same way that you talk to developers in a certain way, and if you say object array to a developer and you use the wrong term in the wrong place, they will get annoyed. If you use the wrong term for, I don't know, for example, if you use, I don't know, Freud instead of some other psychology guy, which I'm blanking on now, in front of psychology people, they will also get annoyed. So the tip is not actually technical versus non-technical, in my opinion. The tip is tailor your discussion to the audience in front of you, which sounds banal, but it actually, a lot of people just don't do it. If you go into a conversation and you don't know the audience before, and that's perfectly fine, spend a couple hours reading about the topic, learn the phrases, learn who the important people in the industry or in the room are. That's just common sense to me. If you wanna go ahead and talk to people and have your message resonate, then you have to make sure that you are in shape, that you came to this discussion when you know your stuff. And I think that's the core of the issue. People come to talk and kind of blah 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 and expect the message to resonate without working with the people they're talking to. And that's the core of the issue. People are people, and you should talk to them in their context, in their kind of state of mind. Work on that, and magic will happen.
You mentioned, the software developers, to be more specifically. So if you're writing, we know about the stereotypical software engineer that's had a computer since they were 4, and that's been their bubble, and we have stereotypes around that. But also the industry is adapting and changing, and people like yourself come into the industry. Maybe that's not their first career. Maybe they had some other career paths and then they come into this space. And that's definitely been something that I've noticed as someone that employs people, is that there was an early era of hiring people that were very, it was their hobby to program. And so to get paid for it was this amazing thing. And then they're like, this is so amazing. And now we have people also joining, not that we haven't always had this, but there's been more of an influx, I think, over the last decade of people going through boot camps. They're making a career transition from one type of completely different thing over to oh, this seems like an interesting career choice for me. And so they don't necessarily have that hobby mentality necessarily. And they have different context and different background and different communication styles. And so I feel like it's gotten a little bit more blurry as far as what communication works best for software industry as a whole, when there's a lot of different people coming from a lot of different places. And I don't know that always, I've always felt technical documentation has always been very, you might disagree with me, but it can tend to be terse, very specific, right or wrong type of approach to things. And how do you introduce more humbleness into your communication? And we mentioned Oh My Z-Shell as an example. Some of the writing on that README is some of my favorite writing that I've ever done, because I introduced my personality into it. And I've always wondered if that was appropriate or not. But what's your take on when you're writing documentation or details for a very specific technical audience that are maybe going to be using your tooling? How do you try to keep it dry and terse, or is do you have other approaches you're trying to, patterns there you're trying to use?
Right. So actually, to the contrary, I try to make it unterse as possible, or for whatever the opposite of terse is. So I think that your personality as developer shows, and it's very easy to tell when a piece has been written, for example, by there's a Rust developer that I follow now. His name is Amos, Faster Than Lime, I think the website is. And he writes long-form Rust articles. And the previous company I worked for was a big Rust shop. And I was always, just in awe of the way he uses things like callouts on a page to show his personality, because his callouts has these little monkey faces on them, or whatever it is. I don't know, like a chipmunk or something. And inside of them, there's a more kind of personal thoughts or whatever on whatever he's currently writing on. And there isn't, and look at it. So I'm not, while I haven't, touched Rust in the past, since I joined my current company, this person who, I read very, very religiously beforehand, is still so ingrained of my mind because of these personalities that he incorporated into the writing. So 100% you can and you should incorporate writing into whatever you do. And for me, for example, one of the things I really like to do, and it's not writing per se, but it's like the blog post creation, the blog post kind of formation. There's a tool called Excalitro, which is this, a sketching tool. They actually just released a pro version. If you can, go support it. It's an excellent tool. And what they did was they allowed this, JavaScript sketching tool, and I use it to add various things into the articles that I write. So sketches and tables and basically all sort of these things. And this gives my articles, I think, and I've gotten this from people, a sense of, because the sketching tool is kind of comics, it looks like comics a bit, it gives my talk this, I guess, or my words, this essence that it wouldn't have without it. And this is me putting my voice into my writing, right? Or my content, I guess. And that's my example of this. And I feel that when you're writing for other people, you should incorporate some sort of, personality like this, because people will remember. And this will pay dividends in the future when you're trying to make your message resonate.
Important reminder for those listening, if you're writing content, and I think it's always interesting where you try to have a sense of like introducing your own, just making it you, but also in the context of like when you're in a company and you're maybe participating in the company's blog or the company's documentation, it's like, does the company or the organization or the open source project have a personality or not? Or like, is there a tone that you're trying to keep consistent? And that's always been like one of the things with like, Oh My Z Shell that with the other people that have helped me maintain it, I've always been I want it to feel delightful for everyone that uses it. How do we use that as a value in our communication and our writing, any of the materials we're posting, or just the goofy things we might do, just how can it be delightful and inviting, I think, if anything. So I think that's helpful to think through for folks listening. So
if you don't mind, I do want to mention something about what you just said about documentation and, being part of the company. So especially if you work for a startup, but even if you work for a larger company, there's usually a product marketing manager, and that person is in charge of, again, it differs from company to company. I don't want to overgeneralize, but a product marketing manager a lot of the time has a lot of, this decision about how the entire product looks like, and the documentation is often, a big part of it. And if you are in, on good terms with that person, that might help you kind of push, I guess, your agenda in that sense, but not in kind of an evil way. What I'm saying is, if you think that an audience, and your people, if you work for a company and you're a developer, you usually know, if it's a developer, oriented tooling or whatever, or an open source project or whatever, you kind of know the audience that you're working with, because a lot of the time it's you, right? So you would also use the tool if you were on or you did, in a previous life. So you know what works. And if you can find a way of incorporating that personal thing into the documentation, and Vercel comes to mind. I don't even know what personality Vercel has. I have no idea. But I know Vercel, and it's ingrained in my mind that they write in a certain way. And to me, it always felt very not repetitive in a bad way, but consistent, right? And this consistency is because someone somewhere, probably a product marketing manager somewhere at Vercel, knows their stuff, and they created a tone for the documentation as part of the entire product marketing play. And you should too, if you have some influence there. It's important and it makes a change.
Having like a style guide that might be more extensive than like we use Oxford commas or not, but more of like, here's the vibe or the things to try to think about as we're embracing it when we produce some content. Does it meet these sorts of expectations? And I like that you mentioned consistency. That can definitely be helpful. I'm thinking about some of the blogs or the companies I follow for information, for reading the materials. It's like, oh yeah, the ones that have a certain, like I enjoy, for whatever reason, it resonates with me. Not every company does. And so that's like finding, that connection there, I suppose. So a couple of quick last questions for you, Tom. So in terms of, is there a non-technical, non-software related book that you find yourself recommending to technical people that you work with on a regular basis to check out and read?
Yes, The Hacker's Diet. So The Hacker's Diet by John Walker and it's I think the second or third podcast that I mentioned the same book on, because it's transformative. So John Walker is the guy he's the founder of AutoCAD, which is a modeling software. A very it's old school, but it's still a de facto standard in many parts of the world, in Israel as well. And the way he wrote the book was, he said, I'm an engineer, and because I'm an engineer, I know engineers, and I know that engineers like to think of problems as solvable things, because it's literally what we do for a living. But losing weight is one of those things that you have many diet books on the topic, right? Lots of people write diet books, but nobody writes diet books for engineers. And why is that? Because losing weight is literally a physical problem by definition. So why aren't we looking at it as we would look on, as debugging some problem in work? Why aren't we looking at it the same way? And this book, in a very, again, engineering, hacker-friendly way, if you will, talks about it in a way that resonated with me, speaking of personality. And he's super sarcastic. It's a great book, regardless of whether you want to lose weight or not. But I lost 30 pounds over the amount of time I read the book in, because it has a system that resonates with me as someone who builds systems. And this is a remarkable thing. And I recommend it to everyone. Please, if you're having struggle with your weight, I know I did and I still do. Please read The Hacker's Diet by John Walker, and it's a free book. And just go and grab it. I'll send you a link, Robby, and you can put it in the show notes later.
That would be awesome. Where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations about software development online?
So first of all, there's my own personal blog, so granot.dev. It's the same as my last name, .dev. Feel free to check it out there. Also, I write quite a bit for our company blog, so lightrun.com/blog. Just look for Tom Granot. All of my information is there. It's usually one of the top posts, so it wouldn't be difficult to find, but it's there. And I'm also on Twitter at Tom Granot, exactly my name. And this is enough social media and being out there for one person.
Excellent. Well, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Tom. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Rob. It's been a blast for me as well.